This is a story about someone who didn't know their life was changing until it already had. It began on what felt like the most ordinary of Tuesdays. There were no booming declarations from the heavens, no dramatic twists of fate, just the familiar, rhythmic hum of a life in motion. For Alex, the day unfolded just as it always did. The alarm clock buzzed at precisely 6:30 a.m., a sound so ingrained in his routine that he often silenced it before fully waking. He shuffled to the kitchen, the cold floor a brief shock to his system, and started the coffee maker. The gurgling sound it made was the true start to his morning, a promise of caffeine and the energy needed to face another identical day. He showered, dressed in the usual uniform of comfortable but uninspired clothes, and grabbed a piece of toast on his way out the door. The commute was the same sea of brake lights and the low thrum of the car radio playing songs he'd heard 1,000 times before. At work, emails were answered, meetings were attended, and the clock on the wall ticked forward with an almost agonizing slowness. Everything was exactly as it should be, a perfectly assembled puzzle of predictability. Yet somewhere between the third coffee of the day and a spreadsheet that seemed to stretch into infinity, a strange feeling began to surface. It wasn't a sudden jolt or an epiphany. It was more like a quiet hum beneath the surface of his awareness, a subtle dissonance in the otherwise perfect symphony of his routine. He found himself staring out the window, his gaze unfocused, watching a leaf spiral slowly to the ground. For a fleeting moment, he felt an odd sense of detachment, as if he were watching a movie of his own life rather than living it. He shook his head, blaming it on a lack of sleep or too much caffeine, and forced his attention back to the screen. But the feeling lingered, a quiet passenger that had joined him for the ride. It was a subtle shift, so small he almost missed it, but it was there, like the first hint of a changing season in the air. Nothing was wrong. Not really. Nothing was broken. But something, somewhere deep inside, felt different. As the day bled into evening, the feeling grew heavier, settling in his chest like a dense fog. It wasn't a physical ache or a sharp pain that he could pinpoint. It was a weight, a profound, bone-deep heaviness that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He went through the motions of his evening, making a simple dinner, tidying the kitchen, scrolling aimlessly through his phone. Each action felt like it required an immense, unseen effort. The laughter from the sitcom on the television felt distant, hollow. The curated happy lives flashing on his social media feed seemed like dispatches from another planet. He realized, with a startling clarity that cut through the fog, that he was tired. It wasn't the kind of tired that a good night's sleep could fix. This was a weariness of the soul, a fatigue that had settled in his heart. He was tired of the performance. He was exhausted from the daily act of pretending that everything was perfectly fine, that this quiet, monotonous rhythm was all he wanted or needed. He was tired of smiling when he felt nothing, of saying, "I'm good. Thanks," when the honest answer was a tangled knot of confusion and emptiness. He was tired of pushing down the quiet questions that bubbled up in the dead of night. Is this it? Is this all there is? For so long, he had been ignoring the gentle, persistent knocking of his own feelings, treating them like unwelcome visitors he hoped would eventually give up and go away. But they hadn't. They had simply waited patiently until their collective weight became too heavy to ignore any longer. This heaviness wasn't a sign that he was broken. It was the cry of a part of himself that had been silenced for far too long, a part that was desperate to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged. That Tuesday didn't fix everything. The sun rose the next day, and Alex's life, on the surface, looked much the same. The alarm still buzzed, the coffee still gurgled, and the world outside his window continued to turn as it always had. There was no magical solution, no sudden, cinematic moment where all the pieces of his life clicked into a new, perfect arrangement. The fog didn't instantly lift, and the path forward didn't suddenly become clear and illuminated. The weight in his heart was still there, a familiar companion. The world hadn't changed at all, but Alex had. That day gave him a single, precious gift. It wasn't happiness, or clarity, or purpose. It was something much simpler, and perhaps more powerful. It gave him honesty. For the first time in a long, long time, he stopped pretending. He allowed himself to sit with the uncomfortable truth. He was not fine. He was tired and lost and unsure. In admitting this, not to anyone else, but just to himself, a tiny crack appeared in the facade he had so carefully constructed. It was through this crack that a little light could finally get in. The honesty didn't solve his problems, but it changed his relationship with them. He was no longer running from the feeling of being lost. He was standing still, acknowledging it, and for the first time, truly looking at it. And sometimes that raw, unvarnished honesty is the only ground solid enough to build something new upon. Sometimes honesty is where change truly begins. Maybe this story isn't about Alex. Maybe it's about you.